Welcome to the Counselor's Chair, a podcast brought to you by Traverse Counseling Services. Join us as we explore all things human, mental health, psychology, philosophy, and a few extras. Be sure to check us out on all forms of social media and visit our YouTube channel at The Counselor's Chair. Hey everyone, Josh here. Thanks for listening today as we're going to touch on some ideas that are very personal to me. In this episode, Andrew interviews me on the topic of death and how awareness and acceptance of death can increase your quality of life. I took this opportunity to put words to thoughts I've been having for some time, and I hope this is good content for you to be thinking about. Also, I hope this provides a schema for how to think and talk about difficult topics. I really use this as an opportunity to literally think out loud, so hopefully letting you into my process is helpful. All right, now get to the podcast. We hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so Josh and I were talking a few weeks ago about possibly changing the format of the podcast and just trying to figure out just kind of the best way to approach that. I think part of the reason we wanted to kind of look at format was just because, you and I have had substantial conversations that I think we wish that had been recorded. So we're just going to kind of switch it up a little bit. This is going to be more like a conversation, just whatever comes up. In the psychology world, we might call this stream of consciousness. Josh and I might just call it a typical Sunday evening dialogue. Uh-huh. And we're just going to see where we go, see where we end up. Sound good?
Sounds good to me, man.
Awesome, man. So what's on your mind?
Well, so I was thinking about this on the way up here to record, and I think I like the format. We'll kind of see how it goes. I mean, right. The worst that can happen is that it doesn't go well, and
we just won't post it.
And you're not paying for it anyway, so right. That's good. I wanted to take the opportunity. A lot of times when I meet with clients, I give them exercises in free association. And a lot of times those exercises are really difficult. Free association is kind of like what Andrew was talking about with stream of consciousness, where, you kind of have a general idea of what you might want to think about, but you don't really know quite how to put words to it, and you don't know how it's going to emerge. But instead of trying to control that, you just let it emerge, whether it's in writing or speaking, sometimes in different various forms of art. Today it's going to be our conversation, and hopefully Andrew and I have had countless very deep, good conversations, and so hopefully this is just as organic, though there is a microphone and it is recording, and other people are going to listen to this. Yeah. Definitely a little different.
Also, it'll maybe help me a little bit because just in case anybody was wondering, I have a little bit of anxiety doing this, and we've also talked a lot about, I think actually what brought up the change was me just kind of expressing like this whole idea that I feel like I can't really be myself, so maybe this will kind of knock the edge off for me to be able to free associate naturally, and maybe we'll take off a little better. I can have a little better content and input.
Well, it definitely puts me in a situation that is different. I'm basically, what I'm coming in is I'm just going to share literally what I've been thinking about over the last few months, and I'm going to attempt to make sense of it with you because it's in my head and it kind of makes sense. But I think, excuse me, I think putting it out into words will actually help me formulate it better. But thinking of it in regards to, I'm talking with Andrew here. Like, it can't just be making sense in my own head. I actually have to put words to this in a way that makes sense to Andrew, and frame it in a way that we can actually dialogue about it versus it being a monologue, which is typically what's in your head. A lot of times it's good to challenge the monologue, get somebody else in there, make it a dialogue conversation.
This is why we have a job.
Precisely. Just described therapy. So how much are you going to charge me at the end of this?
Quite expensive. A friend's discount.
Yeah, friend's discount. Right on. Well, cool. As far as what I think we'll be formulating today, and these are conversations that Andrew and I have had, which will be helpful on both ends. It'll certainly be helpful for me because he's knowledgeable in this area too. But I actually want to talk a little bit about existential therapy, my thoughts about it, and what I mean my thoughts about it, not just my thoughts of existential therapy, but like the thoughts that I have as an existentially geared person. So this is not like a precursor or a course on existential therapy, though you might learn a little bit about it. This is my own internal existential wrestling, so it's a little vulnerable at the same time. And if you're not familiar with what existential therapy or what existential thought is in general, existential thought is a mainly philosophical term that refers to trying to understand our existence and our place within existence, trying to make sense, trying to make meaning, trying to formulate some sort of order around what feels like it. There's a popular book in philosophy called Sophie's World, and in this book, it's described as the universe is described as the rabbit being pulled out of a magician's hat, and we are like little microorganisms on the rabbit. Like we're like infantile little bugs on the rabbit, and we climb up the top of the hairs to try and catch a glimpse of the magician, right? It's like to try and catch a glimpse of how in the world this works. But who knows, maybe the universe is just as shocked that it appeared as we are. Who knows? And these are sort of some existential ponderings, is like trying to figure out, okay, so what is our place in this? And you see a lot of attempt by religion to formulate answers around this. Obviously, we have ancient wisdom and ancient stories through all different types of religious traditions. Some are referred to as myths. Some are referred to as truth. I mean, each person kind of has their own take on these things. But we see that this has been the existential wrestlings of man have been, I imagine, around since the moment of human consciousness, right? The moment that humans were able to think about their own thoughts. And there is some me that is thinking about what I'm thinking about, right? There's like a core that is having, that is processing my actual thoughts. And then you start to realize that maybe there's more to you than just your thought process or even your behavior process, that there's some sort of internal workings that's consistently evaluating that and almost having a conversation and a dialogue with your own thoughts as a human.
And being aware of that. Right.
Yeah, I think that awareness, modernly translates to something like mindfulness, right?
Yes.
Which I imagine we'll naturally get into today. So that's a little precursor on existentialism, and existential therapy is a sort of offshoot of that. That is a non-traditional branch of therapy. It has a theoretical basis, not as researched as the others, mainly because it's really hard to research, right?
It's almost more of a philosophy, like a way of life, not so much like a structured modality.
Correct. And it plays out interpersonally in the session. So interpersonal therapists that are really focused on relationship in the room, or relationship with themselves and the world around them, and themselves and other people around them, are generally going to orient in some sort of existential way, even if they're not thinking about it. It's something you can't really teach either. It just sort of comes natural to the mind if you're open to that type of philosophy. It's important to know that Irvin Yalom wrote a book on this and really did put structure. He did create a therapy modality with existentialism, though he is really careful to say that this should not be a all-encompassing single modality. This is not meant to address every issue, nor should it be the only thing that you're using in therapy as a therapist to help your clients, which is significant, because that also means that, I've not put this together. See, this is that process. You'll kind of hear things click together. I'll have my own aha moments, right? Just that statement lets us know that it's important that when we're looking at the world, the existential philosophical questions are not the only things you should be pulling in to try and nail meaning for your own life. Like, there are other things outside of these four existential fears. One being fear of death, one being fear of isolation, one being fear of freedom, and the other being a fear of meaninglessness or purposelessness. Different people use different terms there, but
so are those actually like 4 specific things based off of like Yalom's readings? Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are like kind of like 4 tenets of yes. existential like fears, I suppose.
Yes, they're called the givens.
Oh, okay.
Quote unquote, gotcha. The givens.
Okay.
Not Gibbons, but not like Coach, but Givens.
Gotcha.
Givens. And in a way, you can trace those 4 things straight back to birth. It's almost like you're born right. with these things. They're inherently part of the human problem of existence, and why it's a problem is because a lot of times these fears present themselves in ways that are rather debilitating, particularly through the lens of trauma. However, of these 4 different fears, I've spent a significant amount of time thinking about the fear of death. I feel like it's probably been a 4.5-year journey with this specific thing.
Sure.
More in the last couple of years, Andrew, you could attest to this. I've sort of developed not an obsession with death, but an obsession in regards to understanding how acceptance of death can actually enhance the quality of one's life.
Right.
And so I've spent a significant amount of time around that. And there's one quote that I'd really like to explore. This is actually from Yalom's text, Existential Therapy. You can check that out if you want. It's a textbook, though. I think I might be...
It's probably like $146.
Yeah, and I wound up with a signed one for $25, which was just insane that happened. Anyway, he brings up this quote, and he pulls from other philosophers to formulate this thought, but I really like the way he puts it into words. The quote is this: "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us." So the quote again: "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us." I feel like I should say a prayer after that.
I was about to say that was very pastor-esque.
Yeah, right. Tap into my inner...
And I will repeat myself.
Yeah, my inner familial roots. They're all pastors.
No, Josh and I are holding hands at this moment.
Oh, man.
We're not really.
No, but I wouldn't mind. There's a good, you might hear this and think, what the heck are you talking about? I can kind of paint this metaphorically. There's a certain type of flowers. It's not just a singular flower. There's actually certain flowers that have a very, very short bloom cycle. Some of them only bloom in the dark. Some of them only bloom for 24 hours. Some of them only bloom in shorter times than that, and then they don't bloom anymore. And one of the ways that you can view this quote is like this. If you were to walk through a garden, let's say you were walking, I don't know where there's gardens, whether it's, maybe you have a garden at your workplace, maybe at home, maybe at a university, maybe at a church.
Your grandparents' house.
Your grandparents' house, yeah. You're walking through this garden, and you're admiring what you see. Like, you can see beauty in these flowers. But the knowledge that some of these blooms that you may be seeing are going to perish, and you may never actually get to see one again. Like the knowledge that the bloom is finite and a very small timeline finite. You may stop, if you know this, if you have that knowledge and you know how to identify these plants, you might actually stop and like take a selfie with this thing, right? You might stop and admire the flower. You may stop and reflect on it and get excited and have a whole range of emotions that you're getting to see this thing that you might not ever get to see again because it blooms at such a random time and on such random cycles.
Sure.
And that, I think, is a good way of understanding this quote, is like when you understand the finiteness of your human existence. And let me pause. I'm gonna pause and say something else here. This feels important. Some of our listeners may be Christians. Some of our listeners may not be Christians. I think that the things that I'm talking about throughout this, and that Andrew and I are going to discuss, I think they're relevant to both. Right. I think that they're relevant. They're relevant to both. There are ways in which this fits very well into the Christian dynamic and very well into the non-Christian dynamic or any other religious dynamic, honestly. Okay. So don't tune me out. Don't tune Andrew out. Let's hear this out. But this idea of seeing that your human life is finite. And as a Christian, it's like, well, no, I'm not finite. It's like, okay, like the Christian view is the soul may be infinite, maybe infinite.
Right.
And that's totally fine, but your humanness, your current human state is finite.
Yeah, your life on earth, as we know it right now.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. And as you see it, it ends. And if you take this flower metaphor and you say, well, I am working on accepting that fact. I'm trying to get myself to realize that that's going to happen.
Right.
In that process, though, that death physically destroys your body. Before that happens, before death destroys your body, the idea of dying, the idea of death itself, maybe not the idea of dying, because that usually has to do with some sort of method. It's the idea of death, the idea of non-existence, can actually create in you something that saves the rest of your life from being repressed due to a fear of death that you're not actually dealing with. Yeah.
Sure.
Because it's fundamental in us to fear death. I've heard a lot of people talk about it like this. You don't know the unconscious or non-conscious state. You don't know it. I've been unconscious before, and I don't know that state. I was unconscious, but it felt like forever, and it felt like nothing. It was very, very strange. I don't remember right as I blacked out, but I do remember waking up. So I remember coming from unconscious to conscious. I had a pretty bad
snowboarding. Yeah.
It was a pretty epic snowboarding accident. But I don't remember that state. I don't remember the state before I was born. I don't know if it was conscious or unconscious. I have no idea. There's no way that anybody can say that. Sure. If it was conscious, gosh, it was very faintly conscious. That's for sure, because I can't recall it. But anyway, not knowing consciousness or not knowing unconsciousness, or the lack of consciousness, we can say it that way. Not being familiar with that naturally produces some anxiety when you're thinking about changing to the state of unconscious. Sure. Right? It's like nobody will run head first into a wall just to see what unconsciousness is, right? Not maybe after a couple drinks or something.
Maybe more than a couple.
Right. So there's a natural fear in us of death because there's a correlation between our understanding of death and our understanding of unconsciousness. They seem to run hand in hand with each other. It's sort of natural understanding. Now, the fear of death goes back to what I've thought about infants. I've had 3 infants in my home, and if they don't get fed, if they feel that they're alone, if they're in pain, if they feel threatened, what do? They
cry.
Right? And they don't stop crying. They don't stop crying until that fear, which they can't identify as fear, then through good behavioral work, we now know that that's fear. That's a fear response. We can hook up all kinds of nodes to the body and to the brain and say, oh, that's your...
it's the fear of what comes next. Yeah. More hunger.
Right, precisely.
Right. Yep.
We can also look at that with our now wiser and developed minds and say, well, what is that infant afraid of? Why does that infant have a drive in it to cry and let somebody know or something know that it needs more care than what it's receiving, or it's in pain? The existential approach and my approach is to look at that through the lens of these 4 different givens. Isolation, meaninglessness, purposelessness. So that probably affects an infant a little less. And this fear of death, like fear of something bad is happening and I don't know what it is.
Right. And in childhood, you don't really have any perception. Like there's no, like you can't, like the brain's not wired to where you can kind of observe like, oh, okay, so this is, a mistake I made in the past, so I can learn from that. All you really know is what's happening right now, and that's I'm uncomfortable.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because the existentialist will also say, and I'll say this as well, having kids, it's one of the primary tasks of a parent is to help their child understand and be able to at least put words to what death is at an early age.
Sure.
Like not avoiding the death conversation.
Yeah, of course.
With your children and helping them develop a schema of death. Otherwise, what happens is precisely what you just said, Andrew, is you learn through experiences that you should fear death, and that natural fear in you winds up getting amplified. It gets put on steroids by traumatic instances, by traumas in your life, by death in your life, by seeing other people suffering, by you suffering yourself, by looking at the TV and seeing that the world is even suffering.
So it becomes a part of your personality, really. And I think that's kind of the unconscious part, is when in adulthood and later stages of life, like when you respond in certain ways through avoidance or through addiction or bad relationships or what have you, like that's that kind of unconscious piece that goes back to like what you're talking about. It's almost like the lack of education and the understanding of what I'm feeling right now in the moment.
Precisely. Okay. And the natural human response is to avoid.
Yes.
Right. Is to avoid that feeling. I'd put it this way, right? We bury our dead in places that we don't visit regularly. We also put these graveyards not on display, right? We position them in places where we're not overtly reminded of them. The military does it different. Right. The military, there's sort of a proudness associated.
Oh,
with
yeah,
that
that's
death.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely honoring the dead.
Right. And so there's this. Okay, and see, this goes right back to that meaningful and purposeful death. Is like meaningful and purposeful life. If we feel a person has led that type of thing, we're way more apt to honor them in their death.
Sure.
Whereas vice versa, we kind of know the antithesis of that, or the opposite of that.
So I don't want to derail like what you're saying, but I wonder if there was a shift in our culture in particular, because like if you go to like any myriad of like old churches, right? The cemeteries are right next to the churches where people I can't imagine anybody building a church and then putting a cemetery right next to it now. I don't know of any modern churches that has cemeteries next to them, but any old church built in the 1700s, 1800s, it seems like there's always a cemetery right next to it.
Well, and I think that those cultures couldn't avoid death like we can, right? You look at high infant mortality rate, you look at high mortality rate for ages over 30, particularly in underdeveloped countries in those times and eras. I mean, they didn't have modern medicine. They didn't have groceries. See, this is where it starts getting really interesting. We've formulated whole parts of our society around death anxiety. I believe
for sure.
Yeah, the medical field is an example.
Insurance.
Of that. Insurance is an example of that. Grocery stores being less than 2 miles from your house in every direction in developed countries. Yeah. We have the means to avoid the problem of death.
Right.
And in previous centuries, previous time spans, death had to be a normal, maybe not a normal part of life, but a much more accepted part of life. They had to confront it more often. It was way more real. Death was behind way more corners for them. Death is behind less corners for us because of how well insulated we've made ourselves from it. I mean, just the simple act of brushing your teeth. This is my favorite one. It's like, why do you brush your teeth? Have you ever thought about that? Like, there's multiple reasons why somebody might brush their teeth. Gosh, yeah, I'm really letting you into my head right now. So there's multiple reasons why somebody might brush their teeth. One, they don't want their breath to stink. Well, why don't you want your breath to stink? Why is that a problem? I mean, it's a socially constructed norm, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like your breath stinks. Like, you're not going to have close conversations with people. You don't brush your teeth for a year, and you see how people stand in accordance to you while you're trying to have a conversation. Right? There's a form of rejection in it. Also, what have we been taught happens to our teeth when we don't take care of them? How do we develop infections? Decay, infections. Now, here's the wild thing, is if we didn't have dentists to reconstruct your teeth for you, right? And we didn't have dentists to cut out and rot and decay and infection from your teeth. We actually know this from going back hundreds of years and seeing that people actually die from that. Yeah. And not only that, but if they happen to live in our socio-cultural norms, they would likely die with some distance between them and the people around them.
For sure.
And so you start to look at just these simple ways in which we've insulated ourselves from death. Everything from a grocery store being right down the street to a fast food restaurant chain being able to take over the world like a Chick-fil-A has, right? There's a reason for that. Like, not only are you having your death anxiety met by someone at a drive-thru, the reason why Chick-fil-A has become so popular is because they treat you with a certain amount of respect while they pacify your death.
Okay.
Isn't that wild? Yeah. It's like,
right.
When we really start breaking down the psychology behind this, we see how deeply rooted our fears actually are. So with that said, I hear people frequently say, "Oh, I'm not afraid of death." It's like,
I'm 100% positive I've said that to you.
Yes.
And you called me out on it very quick.
Yes.
Because you said, how often do you work out a week?
Yeah. Yeah.
What supplements? What's your diet look like?
Yeah, precisely. And with that, right, there's not, I want to be clear with that too. I wasn't like, I wouldn't demean Andrew for taking care of his body, right? That's a good thing.
Well, it was a conversation just like this.
Yeah.
There was nothing demeaning. You were asking me questions like to help me gain understanding.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But what you see is varying levels of anxiety behind people's rationales for doing it.
Right.
Right. At the most pathological end, that's an eating disorder. Right.
Sure.
And at the most negligent end of it, it's diabetic.
Right.
Well, I understand that there's genetic factors into that, but just for the case of like putting some polarized things next to each other, or maybe at the other end of that is maybe something like the biblical definition of sloth, maybe something along those lines, right?
Crushing a box of cinnamon buns every day. Yeah, got it.
Right, there you go. Yeah. So we have these two varying things, and I think depending on someone's awareness of their own anxiety with these fundamental fears that we carry, and again, there's a really important thing to tease out there. Fear and anxiety seem to have been like amalgamated in modern psychology.
Sure.
They get used interchangeably, but from my perspective, anxiety is an emotion that is a result of existential fear or dread. Now, I understand that's not going to be the most popular thing, but I feel it makes a lot of sense. Sure. When we're talking about this, you have this fear of death, and you have a certain awareness of it. There's a certain height. Like, you have this awareness spectrum, but then you also have a sort of intensity spectrum that plays out within it as well, based on how exposed or not exposed you've been to death itself.
Sure.
So somebody who's been exposed to a lot of death in their lifetime may have an increased intensity and sensitivity to death overall. And so they have a higher anxiety because they've had to confront the fear. Now, that also gives them a high potential to accept death more than others who have not been exposed to it as much, because they have more experiences to deal with. Sure. So we kind of have these two things that we're looking at, these two continuums, intensity and awareness. Now, I would say this: when you look at that statement, "I'm not afraid of death," right? I'm not afraid of death. Fair enough. I don't want to use this podcast to like burst anybody's bubble.
Burst my bubble.
However, I think we can just ask some very simple questions. Okay. Very, very simple questions to kind of illuminate death anxiety. Something like what I asked Andrew, like how frequently do you work out, right? How frequently do you work out? How frequently are you checking your bank accounts? How frequently, well, it's responsible to check your bank accounts, but how frequently are you checking those bank accounts?
Cleaning your home.
How frequently are you cleaning your home? Like you can look at that. What type of food
washing your hands,
brushing your teeth, putting shoes on. Sure. Imagine how much your life would shift if you decided not to wear shoes from this point forward. Yeah.
Somebody's grandmother definitely said you'll get hookworms.
Yeah, I think that there's that aspect of it. There's the social impacts of it. There's the injury impacts of it. And you might look at that and say, well, that's just common sense. Like that's just social norms. And my question to you, which is what existential ideas are and where my head is right now, is, well, why are they norms? Why is that common sense? See, there's something to be said for not just looking at the world and saying, oh, yes, the world exists, right? And, oh, yes, these things exist. There's something for looking at the world and saying the inflection makes a difference. Is you infuse it with curiosity and you say, oh, the world exists? Like, why? And why does it exist in the state that it's in? What drives it? Again, people turn to religious things because they seem to be more controlled and formulated.
Right.
But I've been raised in that tradition. I have a lot of respect for the tradition. And I actually have been challenged to look at my tradition and say, okay, if my tradition was completely false, just completely false, can I accept my death into oblivion? Into
the death of consciousness.
Yeah. Can I accept my death into the death of unconsciousness? Can I also accept the world in which it exists with its suffering, pain, malevolence, joy, hope, meaningfulness, or purposefulness? Can I accept all of those things minus my religious structures? Now, I happen to believe my religious structures are so ingrained in me because of the way I was raised that, I really, really had to dig them out to an extent.
Sure.
Because of this quote, actually, because my religion insulates me from the idea of death. And I know that it does. I'm not dumb to that. And I don't think it makes the religion false or bad either. I don't think it makes the religion ignorant. But I think what it can do is cause you to put your eggs in a basket that you're not existing in yet.
Okay, so
go for it.
So, I mean, it almost kind of robs you in regards of, you're living for what comes next instead of living for what's right now.
Precisely, which I think is laden in Scripture to actually pay attention to what you're doing now. There's whole books of the Bible, like Proverbs, where they're devoted to trying to give you wisdom to navigate your day right this moment.
Right, but that's kind of scary. That's a little, I want to say, maybe for the lack of a better word, almost a little selfish to do things for yourself, for others, for an eternal reward, right? Mm-hmm. Versus just doing things in the moment, or doing things in your life right now just because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
I don't know.
You just nailed it. Just nailed the problem with gutting religion, and it's the one that I've been struggling with. Now, I'm going to speak this very clearly. I'm sure my grandmother or something is going to be listening to this. I have not removed myself. Sure. I have not removed religion from my life. But what I realized is I had to perform what has been, I think, a 2.5 year long exercise of of removing religion from removing religion and letting religion be what it is, and letting the gospel be what it is, and letting what I think is truth be what it is, outside of my desire to use it to pacify fear. And like, this is the atheist platform, right? Mm-hmm. The atheists say you use religion to pacify the fears of your existence and ultimate return to the earth,
right? Yeah.
Like, but it can't. It becomes less of an argument if me as a religious person, I tease out the religion from pacification of my own fears and deal with the fears themselves and look for answers to the fears of existence itself. And it's not some, I have hope in heaven. I hope that I will see God and that will make sense of all of this. Right. I actually am discovering that when you tease those things apart, there's a certain amount of sense that you can make with the fear of death without actually having to rely on some hopeful future. And I think it's found in this quote, this idea that the physicality of death may destroy you, but the idea of death may save you. Right. We see this in a sort of natural response with people who have chronic illnesses that are going to end in their early death earlier than they anticipated it, right? They were going to die anyway at some point in time, but now they've been diagnosed with something that says you have 6 months. Yeah. You can see this, that there's studies that have been done on this actually, and Yalom references these studies, but you can look at guys like Rollo May. You can also look at studies from Viktor Frankl's work in concentration camps. Well, he didn't. His work in concentration camps was actual work experience in those concentration camps and seeing what kept people alive. But I think to come back to that point, like, you can look at these different works and see that the quality of the chronically ill diagnosis person's life can drastically increase or drastically decrease. Right. So they can accept that death and what it means for the next 6 months of their life, and they live differently in a positive direction, or they reject and deny the death and become incredibly depressed that they are no longer going to exist in the state that they have. This is what I've discovered, Andrew, is like, when we look at that negative trajectory, why would someone get depressed at the idea of their death?
It's scary.
Precisely.
I mean, it's like, there's just, and plus, the fear of the unknown, and it's just everything that drives anxiety. It's like, well, what comes next? Could it be more pain?
Bingo.
Or could it be something like a reward, right?
Right. Flip that coin too. There's the fear. But if someone is scared that they're going to no longer live in the state in which they're living in, that means that the state that they're living in, they conceptualize it as better than death. When you look at that, it's like a natural indicator that there must be there has to be some drive in you to live. Right. Why would you fear death? There's the fear of unconsciousness, right? But it so flies under the radar. Nobody's thinking about that on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. Why is everybody working to improve the quality of their life? Like, because they see some sort of value in the world around them. Right. Why, when someone is faced with a chronically terminal illness, might they start seeking out and doing things that they wish they had done for forever?
It's like that game you play. It's like, if you found out you're gonna die in 6 months, what would you do? Mm-hmm. No. But it's like, why don't you do that anyway?
Precisely, because we're going to die. But when you move the needle closer, you have to accept it. Yeah. But our insulation pushes the needle out of our conscious awareness, and we're not thinking, I'm going to die in 6 months.
Yeah, everybody who joins the military, nobody's thinking, I'm going to die.
Right.
Like, nobody actually thinks when they go on a deployment. And I've heard, like, dozens of military personnel say this. It's just like, well, yeah, I never thought, like, nobody thinks it's going to be me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this goes, and that I think that nobody thinks it's going to be me.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can bring that around and say that's the atheist argument. Is like we do everything we can to prevent ourselves from thinking that we're going to be the one.
Right.
Here's where I've tried to navigate that as a religious person. But what if I've worked on accepting my fear of death, and I find that the wisdom in the Christian tradition, or the wisdom in the Buddhist tradition, or the wisdom in the Hindi tradition, what if I find that the wisdom in those scriptures actually is going to enhance the quality of my life while I still have it? And I'm making a conscious choice to engage in that religious activity, those religious beliefs. I'm choosing to put my belief in this system because as I've dealt with my fear of death, as I've properly dealt with it, like, okay, I'm going to die. My bloom is very short in the scope of start of the universe, end of the universe. Sure. Like I don't even know if it's a blip on the radar. Like it is such a quick bloom cycle for me. Like when you pair it into, and even if you're like a new earth creationist, and I think it's only 15,000 years old, like you're still just a blip on the radar. Right.
Yeah.
And so when you see that, it's like, when I see that, I'm going to personalize that. When I see that, it makes me realize like this life, this moment, this conversation it makes absolutely no sense that I'm allowed to have it. Like the series of events for me to have been born and to exist in this moment, for us to have met, for us to be having this conversation. Like when you consider the statistics of that, it puts winning the lottery to shame. So I like when I wrap my mind around that, it's like, and when I'm able to put the end cap on it of like, I don't even know when I'm going to die. Mm-hmm. It makes this moment, because for all I know, I could drop dead right now of a heart attack. Like it makes this moment even more unreal that it's happening to me. I'm sort of baffled more by the idea that I get to live than I am scared of dying. Now as I've teased this out and as I've worked with this idea, I feel like my choices in regards to religion are informed by a desire to live a life in accordance with what I see and what I conceptualize as God. Like, and God no longer becomes a pacifier of death. God becomes a guide for life. And I think that you wind up people can put anything in the place of God. You say, I don't believe in God. It's like, actually, you have a value system. You have a hierarchy system in which you place importance on things. I would just say that the highest thing on your hierarchy is your God.
Yeah, it's whatever motivates you.
Right.
To get out of bed.
Precisely. Yeah. And I think, I forget who says that. I totally
AA.
Yeah, AA, right. But I mean, if you want proof for that, just look at how you have placed value on different restaurants, in different restaurant experiences. Like you place value on things, and you put a high value on some things and a low value on others. For me, when I say God, I say that God becomes directly engaged with my life in the moment, because I'm actually looking for sources outside of myself to enhance this experience while I actually have it, because I'm grateful for it.
Sure.
Right. And I'm not like, that's not theoretical to me. That's become my reality. Right. And even in the throes of depression and anxiety and seeing the suffering of myself, my friends, my family members, like there is this sort of unshakable thing in there that has been developing in me that is like, no, these things are sort of, they're the contract of me accepting to live today. It's in the contract of human existence for these bad things to happen.
Sure.
And I think so many people say, well, God is the author of that. I say that's actually not really that important to think about.
Right.
Like we think about God, at least I think about God in accordance with this idea of like how do the concepts of God, the Word of God, my position to God, like how do these things influence my day to day?
Right.
It's no longer, and that's where I now struggle with the atheist criticism of that type of way of, or just the atheist criticism of Christianity, particularly in this lens. It's like, but what if I'm not using it that way? What if I do address my fear psychologically and do so on a daily basis and try to accept and try to move forward to accept this idea of death, and that I don't really need to insulate myself with it. I will definitely participate in the social norms, but not because I'm anxious, or my awareness of my anxiety is high, but the intensity of my anxiety is low.
Right.
Yeah. It's a way to kind of pull that scale into it. In a sense, I feel like this exploration for me has in a sense saved me. Now, this is what blows my mind.
Can I throw something on there?
Yeah, please. Sorry, yeah.
You're sweating.
Yeah,
getting fired up over here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is just something that I would tell when I worked with drug addicts a lot. There's always the looming possibility and likelihood of death when you're using certain substances, and that's something that they would talk about regularly. And so I would talk to them. I would generally just tell them like, hey, we're talking about the finality of death, but what we're forgetting is that every day we wake up, we're born again. Mm-hmm. And so what do we do with today? So that kind of makes the whole like one day at a time statement hold a little more weight.
Yes.
I mean, it is, so what are you going to do? I mean, we have symptoms, we have things that come up, we have pain. So do we do things to make the pain worse, or do we do things to learn about ourselves and manage the pain?
Mm-hmm. I didn't expect this to go in a religious direction, but it is, and I'm just like letting that. I think I struggled to understand what prayer is, what prayer truly is, and a journey that I think I took with prayer was that I expected prayer to change me more than it would change God. Actually, I think I took it with that soul approach. Like, so often we hop in the car, and this was a common thing when I grew up. It's like we'd pray before we went on a long trip, like God,
travel mercies,
right?
Hedge of protection,
right? But I've started praying differently in regards to something like that. What I actually say is, God, give me, enlighten me, give me the wisdom to know how to drive properly to work.
Yeah. Hypervigilance and alert.
Right. Yeah. It's like I will pray for a hedge of protection, but then I will blow through a yellow light.
Yeah.
Right? I will not come to a full stop at a stop sign. Right. It's like when I started praying in a different manner, like, hey, like actually enlighten me to my humanness, please, so that I can work on that. Yeah. It's like when I came to the stop sign and I was about to roll, I was like, ooh, that like I became way more aware.
Make me aware of my distractions.
Right. Yeah. Precisely. Like, and I think that's what you're talking about. Some people will use prayer. Some people will use the AA text. Some people will use their friends, their family. Me personally, my friends are my go-to. My wife is my go-to. My family is my go-to to try and understand how to make choices that alleviate the suffering of those around me, or at very least don't inflict more. Yeah. Right.
Like substances, right?
Right.
Since we're here,
yeah.
Throw it out there.
Using a substance. Yeah. Or how can I increase the quality of my life? And what I mean by quality of life is not increase my insulation to the core fears I have about existing. Because that so often gets confused. It's like increase the quality of my life, more money in my bank account, more harmony between me and my family and my friends and my wife, my kids getting into schools, making it out of poverty, whatever you define that as. Is like, make sure that's not actually intermingling or just serving as a buffer between you and actually accepting the fact that you're finite. Like, what is good, dude? Like we said earlier, it's well, I want to try and live good. I want to try and make good decisions. Well, how do you define good? And I go back to this quote, this idea of death saving us. Well, what is good? Like, I'm curious, like, what comes to your mind when I throw that out there?
What's good?
Yeah, well, not like what's good, how you doing, homie? But what is good? What is good? We kind of have. I think everybody has an innate understanding of what evil is, but it's like, well, what is good?
It's like that whole idea of knowing how much evil you're capable of, but choosing something different. Of not lying to yourself. Of being aware of exactly what you're capable of, but choosing something better.
Yes. Now, we look at the Cain and Abel story, right? And we have our first recorded murder in the Old Testament. And according to the Old Testament, this is our first recorded murder ever, right?
Right.
We look at that, and we have murder out of jealousy, anger, disappointment, rage. The sacrifice wasn't good enough. Right. And what's interesting is God's response to that was just like, hey, just alter your altar, like change your altar, like increase
your perspective.
Yeah, increase it next time. Yeah. But how that was taken by Cain was destructive. And why was it destructive? Well, I tend to think because he felt that the very core of who he was and his position in the world was now threatened. And now he can't. And then maybe it was due to experience. I mean, he's only second generation according to traditional views of the Old Testament. Maybe he had not had the experiences to contend with this inner evil that was brought on by his parents.
Sure.
Right? Like, maybe he didn't understand that. Or maybe he did. Maybe he knew darn well, like, I shouldn't be doing this. But smash my brother. Like, that's not.
Right.
Right? But it speaks to what you're saying. I think that what drives that exercise of evil onto the world around us, when we stop contending with our own ability to destroy the world around us, when we stop contending with lies,
right?
When we stop contending with cheating, stealing, when we stop contending with thoughts of jealousy or anger or rage, when we know that the other person that we're feeling them towards has not done anything personal to us, when we stop contending with those, I think what drives that lack of contending is these core fears. I think that's actually what drives the anger and madness, the homicidality, the suicidality. Like we are fully engaged with the conflicts of isolation, right, meaninglessness, purposelessness. We are fully engaged with the fear of death. We are fully engaged with the fear of freedom, which is basically saying the lack of structure, the complete lack of structure.
Right.
So those fears actually drive us, from my perspective. Those fears actually drive us to do our most pathological actions, or to engage in our greatest forms of evil. So it makes sense that if we contend with those fears with accurate acceptance and use tools that actually address those and be in the experience and realize that I'm only isolated if the lens through which I see everything disconnects me. And that lens can be formulated by trauma. It can be formulated by all sorts of different life
socially
experiences.
Constructed.
Oh, my goodness.
All these ideas that society says you're supposed to be one way, or gender roles. I mean, Dr. Loeb talked a good bit about that. I mean, but that's the thing, right? It's like, these are ideas. Yes. These are thoughts that drive us. Like, and it's what you were talking about at the very beginning. I think part of this is finding sound counsel. Yes. You're talking about finding healthy avenues to kind of process these things through friends and family, right?
Yes.
Otherwise you're just in your mind, and you just reach, and it just grows and grows and grows, and these social norms and expectations and ideas can actually create pathology and violence and addiction and just like all these unhealthy patterns. And part of what we're talking about here also has to do with a lack of ownership,
right?
Which ownership is what? I mean, it goes back to mindfulness. It's just the awareness of self, awareness of your own behaviors, your own. I mean, again, the societal norms. This is how people become conformist, right? Yes. And then get wrapped up in all of this, everything that's happening in the world, and all the. I think we know that the media is pretty good at psychologically empowering that innate fear of death. Because
that's how they make their money.
Yeah.
You're all gonna die. Watch us so you don't die, right? Yep. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that was it. But no, that it's. But I mean, it's really sad.
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to get off on like a media thing, but no, I mean it's not just in our own mind, right? It's not part of our own consciousness. Like these things we're like, we hear these messages day in, day out. And I think part of our job as therapists is to bring awareness to those things. Like, okay, you do realize like some of these thoughts that you're having, these expectations, like they're only thoughts. The thoughts themselves can't kill you.
Right.
But it's actually causing you pain. It's just this awareness of, what's happening around you, but it's really actually just causing you pain, and you're reiterating by the behaviors that you're doing. So let's hit the brakes on this. Let's bring some ownership and awareness to the things that's causing you more pain.
Yeah, and those behaviors that you're talking about, the more awareness you have of that behavior that insulates you.
Yeah.
It's a substance use. Maybe it's cutting. Maybe it has to do with eating. Maybe it has to do with
just ruminating.
And separating yourself from the world around you. Right.
It's like I had a flat tire this morning, so my day is ruined. Well, no, you had a flat tire this morning. That's really lame, and you relate to work, but it's your choice if that ruins your day, right? But I mean, that's a very simple example of how this grows and grows and grows and builds, to where we create these phobias, and then we act out of impulse, and that's why, everybody buys guns.
Right. Well, and you just hit on a really important aspect, this idea of what we actually have control and choice over, right? Because we have this fear of freedom, and I didn't think I was going to get into it, but this fear of freedom that says, like, we can't operate if there's absolutely no rules. Right? It freezes you. Like, there has to be some sort of construct.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is the fear becomes so great that we have to have construct, that it winds up impeding on our flat tire moment, where it's like we want to blame the construct, right? Like, we actually don't want to have control. We don't want to have the freedom. We want something to tell us whether that was good or bad or not. We want something to tell us if it should ruin our day or not. Like, that there's an actual fear of having to make that type of choice for yourself, and it's legitimate, dude. Like, I think that's where if you tell someone, well, it's your choice, how are you going to view it?
Right.
And you said it, it's kind of like that's a simple way of putting it, and it's like taking a finger and sort of mashing it on a nerve that has been open since God knows when, right? And so we find a certain measure of defensiveness in us. It's like, oh, that's not, but you're just telling me that I can choose whether or not I'm happy or not. It's like, no, actually, no, it's very different. What we're saying is that in order to properly contend with the fear of absolute freedom, in order to contend with your desire for structure, you have to pursue ownership.
Yeah.
That's the only way to combat with that fear, is to try and establish ownership. And in that moment, you actually can have ownership, right? The flat tire moment. But it's a tendency to become defensive, or it's like, oh, you're choosing to think that way.
Yes.
But it's subconscious. That's the thing. It's a subconscious choice to do this. And what you're saying, what I heard in it is like, when the awareness is there, when the awareness becomes present, you now have the choice.
Yeah, it's like, okay, so this is, oh man, I hate having a flat tire. This is super lame. Like, I'm going to be late to work. I'm going to be late to a meeting. Yes. This is going to cost me some money, but it's okay. Yeah. Like, I'm just going to change my tire. I'm going to go on with my day. Like, this is super lame, but this doesn't alter my life, right? Yes. Or there's the impulse. The impulse is like, this always happens to me. Like, my day is ruined. Like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to complain and tell everybody about this and just make, kind of a show about it, because we want people to like, empathize with us, sure, right?
That connection, right? We don't want to be isolated,
yes.
Right? So it all comes back to these things. Go ahead. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just that awareness, right? The awareness gives you the option, because we're all going to have our impulse drives, and this is what we were talking about earlier. This has to do with the personality building and the trauma and the things that happen in childhood, right? That shape our personality. Yeah. But so we're going to have these impulse. I mean, your central nervous system is going to kick in. Your brain's going to interpret the body sensations, the acidic feeling in your stomach, the tightening in the chest, and then and then your brain has to interpret that. And so then that's when it's coming into your consciousness, and then we have a choice to make, right? Yes. It's okay. So do I let this affect my day, or do I accept it for what it is, and then do I move on?
Yes. And I think that's why I actually really enjoy being a counselor, is because there's an opportunity in the therapy relationship to provide a safe enough experience that someone can actually realize that they do have the choice. Because when you've been through so many things that and I'm thinking about, I have some clients running through my head who've just experienced a long string of sufferings. Yeah. It's like, you don't know that you're not maybe aware that it is safe enough for you to take choice and take ownership in those moments, or you think you can't at all. But after doing, a few years of work with a client, what I'll see is that they've actually used the therapy relationship and the safety that has been created in that room to start launching into other areas and experimenting to the extent that they have experimented into the therapy room, because they now have an experience to pair along with it. Right. I think that's one of my greatest joys in being a therapist, is being able to provide those types of experiences for people that say, hey, like, we can bring this to awareness, and if you're contending with the fear, if you're contending with your inner evils, you're likely to actually make a good decision in this. Yeah. And I think that ties back around to like, well, what is good? It seems to me that good is that which contends with the evil, like that sits juxtaposed to it. And what is a good person? Who's a good person? It's like, well, how do we define that? Well, who knows how to define that? But how I define it is you're actually aware of what your fears can drive in you and cause you to do. You're aware of what the fears in others can cause them and drive them to do. And you actively combat those within yourself and within other people. To me, that is what's good. And you start to see the sort of archetypal stories throughout all of recorded history of this emergence of the holy figure. The holy figure takes the journey. The holy figure faces death, succumbs to death, and in some way cheats, beats, or destroys death, and is able to give whatever is the opposite of death to the world around that figure. You see that narrative start to play out, and that's why I say I look to that model, because it makes sense. Like, it makes sense with everything we're saying. Is like, you actually have to look these fears in the face, despite everything you've been through, and say, like, I don't want you to run me anymore. I don't want you to run me anymore. I'm doing things that I'm not proud of. I'm doing things that I can't even get behind.
I'm causing more suffering.
Right. And I'm not gonna participate in that, and I will actively fight against anyone who's participating with that type of behavior in their life. I will help them contend. Again, if they're not wanting the help, that we don't go that far. Yeah. But if someone's wanting the help, we take them that far. Right. If someone's trying to exercise that over you, that's where assertiveness comes in. It's like, no, I will not succumb to that fear. I'm going to try and actually address it, versus just insulate myself with bitterness and shame and feelings of inadequacy over this boss who's been driving me into the ground for the last 2 years. Right.
Thus is the power of memory. Right. We can use our memory to hold on to that trauma, right? To become bitter at that boss, to say, the whole thing of, this always happens to me, almost like the victimhood, the opposite of the ownership mentality, versus, again, just, recognizing that and being able to hold on to those memories of the suffering, the pain, gaining perspective, and using the process of life to try to do things differently. We can't, hold on to all that stuff, and we can, we do, right. But at the same time, it's like, okay, so bad things have happened to me. I've made some really poor choices. We all have things that we wish we could change about ourselves in our journey. But, I think the healthy place is like, well, okay, no, like, what, it's okay. And now I have perspective. Now I have the memory and the conscious awareness of the things that I can do to add to my suffering, or I can try things differently and try a different approach, thus giving you the option.
Right. It also helps buttress you against helplessness.
Right.
Like the feeling of helplessness, because, someone is just going to come along and abuse me again. Yeah. But if the abuse that you've experienced in the past is trapped in a box of fear, you're not actually going to be able to look at that and say, how can I combat it? If it's trapped in a traumatic bubble that is wreaking havoc on these 4 fundamental fears that you are already blessed with at birth. Yeah. So I think when we look at that and we come back around, when we look at that and we circle back around to this idea of like, okay, so how this idea of death saves us, we're looking at the fundamental fear, we're addressing it, we're sort of taking ownership of it, we're trying to choose paths that are healthy and productive, and we're looking to resources outside of us to live good lives. And by good, that means good lives that combat with our own inner evils and try and minimize the suffering of those around us and propel forward into something positive. This fear of death, though, if insulated to such a high degree that you can't engage with your own termination, I don't know that you will be able to look. I know that I wasn't able to properly look at the world around me and be actually aware. Yeah. It's like, and I my Christians and brothers and sisters, it's like Christ had to look at his own death every day. Like, I don't know how he could have been God and not aware of when he was going to die and the manner in which he was going to die. Right. He had to look that into the face he had to look at that every day. And people will say, well, he did that so that I don't have to. It's like, no, he did that as a model of how it works. And that's the reason there's no sting in death, is because you wind up accepting the death for itself and trying to live your current life into its fullest and most impactful manner. Let's take a break, though. I have some really helpful thought exercises that just rolled into my mind that might be helpful in thinking about something like that. So take a break. We'll be back in a few minutes.
All right, so we're back from our break. The creative juices were flowing there, but needed a little time to regroup. And anyway, man, what are your thoughts about where we need to go from here?
Yeah, so I was thinking about a couple different thought exercises that are actually really helpful in regards to what we're talking about. Right. It's really easy with this type of stuff to get in your own head. One, that's why I'm really glad we're having a conversation about it. But two, once you've had a conversation about it, it's really easy to just leave it there.
Sure.
But these things kind of practically force you to deal with your existence in some sort of manner that you feel is productive. Now, maybe not all people, but they're compelling.
I think homework's always a good idea. It's kind of like paying $4,000 to go to a Tony Robbins weekend and getting fired up, but then you still have to live your life. So, So I'm eager to hear about what your exercises are.
Yeah. So the first one that I've found helpful in my own processing is actually from Nietzsche. If you don't know who Friedrich Nietzsche is, he's a German philosopher. For all of his faults and inadequacies and the misuses of his texts, Nietzsche left us with some really, really good things to think about. But this thought exercise is sort of mind-blowing to me, and was mind-blowing when I first encountered it, and still to this day, because it flies in the face of the concept of live like you're dying. Because what I hear that as is like, so fully engage the fear of death. And let it run your life for the next 6 months. Right? Live like you're dying. It's like, no. Like address death as imminent. And he says, look at it like this. So instead of thinking, well, if you die in 6 months, what would you do in that 6 months? Like, what are the things that you would do? Who would you talk to? What are the experiences you would have? Right. What would you do? How would you behave? Right. How would you do? What would you do? What experiences would you seek after? This flips things on its head and says, look, like, how are you going to orient yourself to live? So see yourself as dead as of this moment. Look back over your life. Take a good hard look at it, because you're going to have to live it on repeat, just the way it's happened, not able to make any changes. You'll have to live that on repeat for eternity. Now, I'm not saying this is what will happen. I'm saying this is a thought experiment, right? I don't hold this personal belief. Yeah. But let's say you did. Now, look at your current moment, the moment you're living in. What would you like to shift to make your life more livable and more enjoyable if you have to live it on repeat from start to finish for eternity? Because you're not dead in this moment. The experiment is picture yourself as dead now, right? Yeah. But you're not dead now. We're alive right now. And hopefully, in hope and in essence, we have some future. We have some future to look forward to, like Andrew said, sort of every morning being a rebirth. We look forward to that rebirth. And we say to ourselves, how might we live? What might we shift? What might we change if we had to live this thing over again? Like, when you look at it that way, when you start to see through those lenses, you're not looking at a 6-month timeline to cram in as much as you can. You're looking at your day-to-day life and saying, I need to establish a why. I need to establish a purpose. This is where we get into some deeper work. It kind of pulls you into, okay, if I'm going to address this thing, I'm going to address it with some sort of purposefulness and some sort of meaning, so that I'm adding value to my life. Whatever it is that you value, I'm adding those things that I value into it. So if I have to live this thing over again, I at least know from this point forward, I will live it in a manner that I'm much more engaged, much more intentional, and purposeful with my actions, and I'm keeping an eye on my behaviors, right? I'm keeping an eye on particularly the behaviors that pacify my fears.
Sure.
So that's a very helpful exercise, I think, that promotes both looking at death as as a part of your life that occurs that ends something.
Right.
But then looking at your life currently and saying, okay, like, I'm going to have to live this over and over again. How do I want to do it?
Right.
How do I want to do it? It really does start to shift things. And it also makes you a bit hungry for people that have, hungry for the knowledge of those that have found ways to live good lives and pursue honorable and noble purposes with their lives. As we wind up turning to those figures who've kind of figured out a code. We have thousands of years of code.
Right.
We have thousands of years of recorded history. I think this is where the modern church has struggled, mainly since Azusa Street, for the evangelical Pentecostal forms of denomination and religion is largely disconnected from the history of the church. And so you have the start of a denomination in the early 1900s, and that is its history. Right. That it's not natural to look at the 2,000 years of history and all of the wisdom and all of the thinkers that have come prior to you. And there's so much to pull from there. But that's in the example of religion. We can look in the example of philosophy. We can look in the examples of family. Right. We can look at the examples of fatherhood. We can look at the examples of motherhood. It goes on and on and on. We have this wealth of knowledge that we can tap into and say, this seems right to me. And I think one of the guys that hits the radar for me, and this is sort of another sort of thought type experiment that you can do with yourself, is Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl basically invented logotherapy, which is not really practiced nowadays, but the essence of logotherapy is really infused in a lot of modern therapy, and it focuses on meaningfulness and finding and establishing purpose.
Right.
Very brief lesson on Viktor Frankl. He was a very well-known psychiatrist before World War II, and it was even more well-known after being rescued from the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. So he was taken to a concentration camp, him and his wife. His wife witnessed her walking into a gas chamber, and then I think he spent 4 years.
I believe it's 4 years.
It was 4 years in concentration camps surviving. And put through the same torture and hell that you could picture from these camps. Now, what he realized while he was there, somehow in his state, he was able to pay attention to the fact that people lived when they established some sort of purpose for their living. And a lot of times it was outside of the camp. It was future oriented, but it required the purpose. The purpose was also required to be in the present. So there's this fascinating scene in the book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is sort of his account, where he feels himself die. He knows he's dying. In fact, he participates in a dying, in a human, like, it's human reaction when we're dying to crawl to a corner to try and find a tight space to kind of like hunch over, and he actually falls off of his cot and crawls to a corner and hunches down. He feels himself dying from fever, and he grabs a piece of charcoal and he begins to write.
Oh, right. Yep.
And he literally feels sort of life come back into him, and he's rejuvenated. And in that moment, he sort of establishes this purpose. Well, I'm to write. Like, I am to write. I think we get very lost in this idea of purpose and make it too complex. This moment and this exercise for me, when you put yourself in the corner and you're dying and you need something from inside of you, whether you feel like God put it there or not, it's like you need something from inside of you to come up along and help combat death itself. Meaning and purposefulness are able to do that. For him, it was to write, and he got out and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and that book has changed a lot of people's lives.
Is it like 10 million copies? Is that crazy?
It's something absolutely ridiculous, you know. But what's amazing is the personal reaction that he had to engaging into that, meaning that meaningfulness literally while he's dying. And the irony of this situation is he is a physician and he's been put in the quarters with all of the sick patients and he's been ordered to take care of them.
Right.
So he's been ordered
with
to
nothing.
face with nothing. He's
with
being
like
treated,
water and rags.
He's being treated the same exact way, yet
Right.
he's being asked to take care of sick patients, which is like you see this idea play out, this sort of Christology of like he was given nothing more than what the people in the beds had, yet he was facing their death with them, trying to save them, and all the while now hunched in a corner about to die himself until he engages his purpose and overcomes death in that moment. Well, that's a powerful concept, man. Like, and I think we get it so convoluted, we make it complex, we tie it to career, we tie it to all of these things. Like, years ago, I actually narrowed my own down to my purpose, my meaning is to be intentional. Like, like, at the end of the day, like, how do I evaluate myself?
Right.
Was I intentional? Because that's what I feel like I have been crafted to be, both by my experiences and by my friendships and my families and literature and religion. That's what I've been crafted to be. And so that is what saves me in my deepest despair, personally. In my deepest despair, I engage intentionality even if I feel like I can't. Like, I try to be as intentional as I can, and it's what lifts me.
So it's almost like when you're the idea, like when life gets you down, like not really about to die, but when times are difficult, like when you feel like you're kind of in that corner of death,
yes.
right? Then
yes.
that sounds like that's just kind of your go-to to be intentional.
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes to this quote from Man's Search for Meaning, which is very popular, which I think he actually borrowed from Nietzsche. The quote, he who has a why can bear almost any how. Or he who has a why for life or a why to life
right.
can bear almost any how. And it's a method to combat suffering.
Right.
And it's not one that insulates you from your primal fears. It actually makes you aware that you are living.
Sure.
But you are asking yourself, and you're curious, okay, so why am I living right now? Why will I continue to live? Like, what is my why? And if you have a strong enough why, and you really you work that why out. I mean, you put muscle and belief behind that why.
Yeah.
You can overcome all types of suffering. Sure. Like, I think we see it again in these sort of these archetypal stories that flow through religion. It's like, if Christ did not have the purpose and the meaningfulness that he knew somewhere deep inside of him, that his own death would result in what has been the last 2,000 years since he's died, and also the restoration and atonement of man and God, which is just a mind-blowing concept. I don't know how to fully wrap my mind around it, but anyway, but you look in other traditions and you see a very similar story. There is a clear why and a clear purpose, but it's not because it's been handed to them. Like, oh, here, like some outside force has handed it to them. I can imagine that any of these figures, that any important figure in my life, I don't even have to imagine, like, I've heard their stories. Like, they had to confront the most utter despair within themselves in order to understand why in the world they would persist.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, something I talk to my clients about regularly is this idea of, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? But I mean, having a goal and a standard and expectation for where you're going.
Yes.
I mean, it's the why.
Yes.
It's because we get so lost in the daily grind of our routine. Mm-hmm. We get, pretty comfortable in what's happening, but then I feel like that's where pathology creeps in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When we don't have, I mean, we can, hopefully, like, we have goals, right? Mm-hmm. But then we have this whole idea of like, okay, my life is going to be this way when I get to this point, but it's not. Like, you celebrate that season for a week, 2 weeks. It's like getting a new car, right? It's, eventually it's just going to be another vehicle, you know? But, I think one of the areas that we kind of get lost in is just this idea of, it's more of a marathon. It's a process. So.
Well, it's almost like you can't, like with a why, it's almost like you can't evaluate it ahead of time. Like, my purpose is to get this job.
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, so you get the job and then you establish a new purpose. Really, I think that's like the goal. It's like, why do you want the job in the first place is the why that we're talking about. And you almost have to evaluate that in a sort of retrospect. Like I said, how do I evaluate my why? My reason for getting up every morning, which I feel is to be intentional. I'm going to wake up and be intentional with every task that I have in front of me. To the best of my ability, I will give it my effort. That to me is a good enough why. Why do you get up and do it? It's like, well, I want to be intentional. That is my why. Because I feel like if I'm intentional with what I'm doing, there's gears that click with inside of me that are sort of impenetrable once they start clicking. Sure. Like, not much gets to that, and that's what Frankl was saying about this concentration camp experience. Is the most severe form of dehumanization didn't get to him in a manner of death like it could have.
What is the quote? He says, in the concentration camp, they can take everything away from you, but they can't take away your mind. Is that it? Or I think that was the section where he was talking about the writing.
I can look it up really quick. Let's see. They can take everything away from you. Let's see if we can find it real quick. Of course, million texts there.
Because he talked about the idea of, they shave their heads, they torture them. It was, everything was regimented. Everything was,
yes.
When they go ahead.
Yes, they did. It's severe dehumanization.
Yes,
like, took everything from their boots to their names.
Yes,
right. And their family members.
Yeah, there were a number.
Yeah. The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of one's freedom is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. Bingo.
That's awesome.
Right. And I'll repeat it again.
Go for it.
Pastorally ways. The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of one's freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. And I, like, there is a natural inclination in me to say that's BS. There's something in me that just wants to say that, right? Yeah, like, I can't choose my attitude. Except for, this is why it's so powerful coming from this man. Is like, if anybody has the right to say it, like, this guy does. He's had his humanity stripped away to nothingness.
Yeah, this is a man who was, educated. Like, I don't know what the academic pipeline for psychiatry was back then, but one could imagine it was anywhere from 8 to 12 years, right? To be separated from one's family, which I think is most people's worst nightmare. And beyond.
Yes, or even to know that, to watch your wife die. And to be able to do nothing and not react to it.
I don't think he saw her die. Right. Because he would fantasize about talking to her, but then he reflected later on, like, the timeline that she was already deceased because that was an aspect of keeping him alive, and I think it kind of goes back to the motivation. What do you do with your mind? And so that was. I mean, like I said, part of his main motivation, but in fact, she was actually already deceased. But I don't know that he witnessed her die. I think she was actually separated and went to a different camp, put in a different truck. I could be off.
That might be what happened. I have it in my head, the detail being that they were divided, but sure. He knew that she was going, like it was a gas chamber line.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
So I think he saw her walk towards that area, but didn't see her walk into the chamber or anything like that. Yeah. Gotcha. But knowing that, so correction, knowing that she was dead or going to die in that manner. I mean, it really is helpful, again, to look at these sources of wisdom, people that have seen tremendous suffering and had to face death, and to see how they handled themselves in it. There's a reason we admire people in those scenarios too.
Can we touch on? Okay, so like this man experienced, I mean, the worst thing that, I mean, you could imagine, right?
Yeah, it's the greatest atrocity of the 20th century, I think.
But then, a lot of clients that, that we work with, will say, well, I know that you probably see a lot worse, right? But there's no comparison.
Right.
Because I mean, it's one person's pain, is just as real to them as another person's pain. So Viktor Frankl's pain was just as real to them as a person who has a flat tire on the way to work and is experiencing anxiety. Like that's as real to them as Viktor Frankl's pain. So they're, but again, it's, what do you do with it?
Yes. Well, and I think, what you're saying is totally the human response is the same.
Yeah.
Right. It could be your dog dying tomorrow, and it could be watching your wife walk towards a gas chamber. Like, we all have the same emotional systems.
Yeah.
We operate and function in the same ways. And a lot of times the stimuli doesn't even have to be at the same intensity to elicit the same response, particularly based on what you've been exposed to. Right. You look at that, and the reason I find peace in something like what Viktor Frankl says, or Frankl says, is because there's a measure to which he faced such a tremendous atrocity that it validates the truth for me. Right? It's like it proves true in even the worst circumstance.
Yes.
So it can prove true for me too.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be comparison. It's looking at it and saying, does it work across experiences? And it's like, yes.
Well, he saw in his extreme circumstance, he saw the best in people and the worst in people.
Right.
In the worst circumstance imaginable.
Yep. You should read the book. Not you, but
I've read it like 3 times.
If you haven't read the book, guys, you should totally read Man's Search for Meaning. It's a quick read, and you can also get it on Audible for like $3 or something.
If you come to Traverse, we usually have like a stockpile of we just hand out.
Well, that's so those, as far as some thought exercises go on that sort of infinite loop of life. And also this facing the worst atrocity. What is it that would keep you? What is it inside of you that you would like to motivate and drive you? And again, I to encounter nihilists and atheists who will say to me like, "Well, what's the point of all of that?"
Right.
And my response is actually really simple: is what would you like the point to be? Because you are actually allowed to take ownership of that part, and there's nothing biological, and there's nothing environmental, and there's nothing that says that you can't. Now I understand there's a certain amount of like conscious awareness one needs to engage that level of thinking, right? At least that's what literature says. But who knows? Like, who knows what somebody in a tougher cognitive capacity, or with cognitive struggles, or with cognitive disabilities, who are we to say, and who are we to know what they process? And so I tend to believe, and maybe it's more optimistic, that this is actually across like this checks out to be true across, and can check out to be true across the plane of humanity. Now, I mean, I'm sure there would be people that would argue with me on that, but
well, it's okay. It's your podcast.
Yes,
you can say what you want to say.
Right. I do choose. That is something that I choose to believe in, even though that there's not. I mean, there's not evidence of it, but there's like we believe in a lot of things that there's not evidence of, including like that we have a right to pursue happiness. That's not something we have evidence for, yet we believe it, and it's sort of the sustaining factor of American culture.
Right.
It's in our own documents, the founding of our nation. So,
right.
But anyway, I do believe this checks out. I believe that. Anyway, so
read the book. You can decide for yourself.
Yeah. Read the book. Go for it. Now, so what direction? I mean, what direction does that take us? Well, I think where this has led me in my thought process, and just getting this out actually has been helpful to kind of string these things together, these lines of thought together as we kind of go through them. I think I would hope that the result of a conversation like this, and I feel like the result of this type of conversation for myself even, is to start to look at the things that I actually value. And to start looking at how I treat them, and to start looking at how I want to treat them. And once I've done that, I can sort of examine what in the world is getting between me and behaving and doing and living the way that I would like to live. And I feel like for so much of us, it's actually traumatic experiences. I feel like those things sort of stand as a block, the mental block, whether they exist in repression and we're not dealing in denial, repression and denial, or whether they exist in a way in which they pop up and are triggered in the moment and we don't feel very in control of ourselves.
Yeah, the unconscious steps in.
Right.
Fall into those unhealthy cycles.
Mm-hmm. And I also feel like there are unhealthy religious beliefs that impede. I feel like there are unhealthy beliefs about family that impede, that maybe they feel so foundational you're not willing to challenge them, but they actually stand between you and being authentic. They stand as a buffer between you actually addressing these areas, these four fears that I've brought up. But mainly, I know we focused a lot on death, right? It's like to try and remove these buffers so that you have to confront that you're going to die. And not pacify that with, well, I believe in an afterlife, but to let that thought actually enhance the quality of your life. And what I've experienced is this, like, actually it doesn't increases the quality of your life because it increases your desire to engage with life. That's a good way of saying it. The quality of your life goes up because you're now actually willing to engage with life as it's presented directly in front of you. And for me, it's caused me to look even more into religious principles because I don't know how in the heck to do that.
Right.
That doesn't feel biologically wired in me. Oh, like I know how to engage life properly, right? Like I actually need these outside influences, and I know I pulled from like. I think there are some people that I even went to school with, or maybe even within my own family, that would just be like, you are looking at some really strange avenues to access truth here. And at the same time, we realize that like we, like even when we look in the Christian texts, like the wise men that came to confirm that this was the Savior, this appeared to Mary and Joseph to sort of confirm that this Jesus was a big deal and was the Son of God. they were definitely not Jewish. They were pagans. And so, like, there's an extent to which truth is truth, like,
Right.
regardless of who it's coming from. And that's, I mean, again, that's something that I've been wrestling with over the last decade, with probably since Bible school, is trying to really expand and understand, like, how do I engage life well? What can I pull from in order to engage it well, to contend with my own inner evils, to actually look at death and let it serve as something that can save me? And in my own Christian tradition, how that seamlessly integrates into Christ's death saving me. I mean, there's so many overlaps and parallels. I like one scripture, and we can look at it psychologically. It's been sticking out to me. It's Psalms 25. I like more than one scripture, but I like this scripture particularly. It's the privilege of God to conceal things, and it's the privilege of kings to discover them. And I look at this and I think, man, like, how much hasn't been revealed? Like, how much is there out there, and how much of it just hasn't been revealed to me? I'm not saying there's anything new under the sun, but I certainly don't know everything under the sun. It makes me excited and passionate to learn more, to grow more, to expand my horizons and see how it impacts the trajectory of the generations that follow me in my own family, right? Anyway.
One thing I'd like to throw out there is, so I feel like certain military people have kind of like done this well. So just kind of that whole war brings out the best and the worst in people, right?
Yeah.
And you know, those who have experienced war and experienced loss in war, you know, a lot of them come back and they say, you know, I try to live my life to the fullest in honor of those who didn't get to come home, you know, in honor of those who didn't get to, you know, live their life, you know, to the beyond war, right?
Right.
I don't know. I just it's kind of stuck out to me in a couple of the themes that you've brought up. Just that idea of, even so outside of military and outside of war, but just that idea of almost honoring the dead in a way of doing better for yourself for the duration of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, dude.
There was one point where you were talking about, well, I can't remember specifically what you were saying, but my mind went to the idea of one of the worst atrocities that can happen in a person's life, which would be the loss of a child.
Yeah.
But in reality, a person might think, I can't go on. I can't continue to live like this, you know, with the grief and the magnitude of and the weight of that. But in reality, your life's not going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And you are going to have to live the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes back to, I think you were talking about the Nietzsche
Yes.
philosophy of, you know, if your life lived on repeat.
Yes.
You know, so, you know, if that was the case, you know, even if you experienced the worst atrocities in the early part of your life, but to actually try to, you know, live the best you can to you know, bring awareness, to take ownership, to take, you know, ownership of your thoughts and your impulses, and you might label it as sin or metacognition, or, you know, whatever it is that the pattern that maybe holds you back and causes more pain, but to actually, you know, recognize that to live is to suffer in many capacities, and almost become comfortable with that idea and not lose yourself or fall back on negative coping mechanisms when suffering does come up, because we can't change it, we can't block it. Things are going to happen in our life, and it's going to be unfortunate, but we can again, it's also what Frankel said, right? I mean, it's how you interpret it and what you do about it.
Yes.
Life can't take away. Life can strip you of almost everything, but not your response to how you address the issue.
Yeah. And consequently, ultimately, death will strip you away.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you're living.
Yeah, so get fired up about living.
Yes, precisely. Right. It makes me think of this idea of rippling to, I think it was Socrates that brought it up. But one of the ways in which you do continue to live on is through your impact on those who were close around you. So you can think of your actions as corrective. There's almost a way of, it's like self-redemption. It's like you're redeeming your suffering through your actions and subsequently rippling that redemption into the world around you. Sounds familiar, right? Like these concepts are not new, but we rarely personally apply them.
Sure.
And so, I think it's due to fear. I think fear keeps us from applying them. And if you're struggling to understand this idea of fear, just pay attention to how many things you felt anxious about when we were talking in this conversation, right? What anxiety welled up in you? That's a sign that a fear is being activated. And so,
what are you avoiding? What are you telling yourself that you can't take any more of?
Right. Well, dude, I think my thought maker is.
Yeah, we're about 9 hours in.
My thought maker's piddling out on me. So I think.
So we're gonna take some fish oil, and we're gonna be back in about 5 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. I think I really enjoyed the conversation with you, Andrew. Great questions and great feedback, and I hope this was helpful to anybody listening. I hope that my thoughts were coherent. Is actually a pretty vulnerable place to be, to try and string all of these things together for a discussion like this. Particularly, I don't have any notes and I haven't really prepared. It's really just what has been on my mind.
Well, it's a conversation that's been continued for a long time, so it's not totally just on a whim. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity, and I guess till next time.
Well, and I'd just like to throw one more thing in, and if any of the conversation or any of the previous podcasts have brought any questions or anything like that, I mean, feel free to email us, because I mean, some of the things we covered today, I mean, we've covered a lot of religions and philosophers, and so I mean, if you have a question, we'd love to follow up with you and even create a conversation with the audience, anybody who's listening. So by all means, don't hesitate to ask any questions, and so we can continue the conversation with you as a listener.
Yeah, seriously, if you send us your questions either in email, or if you want to record yourself asking the question, punch it through in an email to contact@infotraverse, we'll play it on the podcast, or we'll read it on the podcast and actually try and answer it. Please, I'm sure that this elicited some sort of response from you. Yeah. Maybe the response is Josh is a little crazy. But I mean, I don't know if that's a question or not. But
we can address it though. I can try to counsel him if he is crazy, and slap him with a diagnosis. Of course, he would owe me some money then.
Yeah, sure would.
So, all right, man. Well, hey, I enjoyed the conversation as well, and you want to finish up?
Yeah, catch you guys next time.
All right, and I'm supposed to say toodles, and I don't want to. All right, see y'all.
See ya.
You have been listening to The Counselor's Chair, sponsored by Traverse Counseling Services. For more information, visit our website at www.traversecounselingservices.com or email us at contact@infotraverse.com. Thank you again for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. This podcast was recorded and produced by Josh Zello.